In the mountains of Kentucky, in a time before modern genetics, there existed a family that seemed to defy every law of nature and medicine, a mother who stood no taller than a child, a father whose body had grown to an unimaginable scale, and between them 12 children. But this is not a story of a large family. It's a story of a medical anomaly so profound, so devastatingly consistent, that it made the doctors who witnessed it question everything they knew about life, heredity, and the cruel lottery of birth. Not one of their children was born without severe, shocking deformities. This is the case of the Caldwell family, a tragic real-life genetic experiment that played out in an isolated cabin, a case that was meticulously documented, fiercely debated, and then almost forgotten. How did this happen? And what does their story, buried in century-old medical archives, tell us about the very building blocks of life? If stories that blur the line between medical mystery and human tragedy captivate you, you're in the right place. This channel is built on diving deep into forgotten histories that challenged our understanding of the world. To help us bring more stories like this to light, consider hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. The chill of a Kentucky March morning in 1897 hadn't yet lifted from the bones of Harlan County when the farmer walked into Dr. Samuel Garrett's office. For nearly 15 years, Garrett had treated everything from mining accidents to mountain fevers in these parts. He'd heard every tall tale and local superstition whispered in the hollows. But this visitor wasn't sharing gossip. He was deeply troubled, shifting his weight nervously as he described a family living in a remote cabin beyond Pine Mountain. It wasn't their poverty that concerned him. It was the children. Every single one of them, the farmer insisted, was born wrong. Garrett had caught fragments of these rumors before, distorted stories of a cursed family, and had always dismissed them as the kind of fearful talk that flourishes in isolation. Yet something in the man's earnest dread, a rawness that bypassed mere superstition, lodged in the doctor's mind. The journey would take the better part of a day through treacherous, winding paths. Was it worth it for another wild goose chase? But the question, once planted, wouldn't let him go. What if the whispers were true? Garrett's horse struggled along trails barely carved into the mountainside, through dense stands of oak and hickory that choked out the afternoon light. This was a world apart from the small towns he served, a landscape that seemed to resist outsiders. As he rode deeper into the isolation, the practical doctor began to feel a creeping sense of anticipation mixed with a professional skepticism. He was preparing himself for what he'd likely find. Perhaps a case of inherited rickets, maybe a child with a clubfoot, conditions he could explain, even if the locals couldn't. He mentally rehearsed the gentle, condescending lecture he might give about heredity. But with every mile the forest grew quieter, as if holding its breath. The path wasn't just leading him to a cabin, it was leading him to the edge of known medicine. When the homestead finally came into view through the trees, it was, at first glance, unremarkable. A crude but cared-for log structure with smoke curling from its chimney, a picture of hardy, if poor, mountain survival. But then the door opened. The woman who emerged to greet him stopped Dr. Garrett cold. She was the size of a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, but her face and proportions were unquestionably those of a woman in her 20s. This wasn't just short stature, it was a compression of adulthood into a frame that seemed to defy biological logic. Primordial dwarfism. The term flashed in his mind, a condition he'd only read about in a handful of case studies in outdated medical journals. The rumors had gotten one thing right. Something was profoundly different here. But as he would soon discover, she was only the first piece of a terrifying puzzle. Stepping inside the dim cabin, the scale of the mystery expanded horrifically. By the fireplace, in a chair reinforced with rough timber, sat her husband. Benjamin Caldwell was a man of such immense size he seemed to spill beyond the boundaries of a single human being. Garrett, an experienced physician, estimated his weight at well over 500 pounds. The man's breathing was labored, his skin stretched taut over a skeleton struggling under impossible mass. And moving around them, in the space between these two physical extremes, were the children. It wasn't just one or two. Garrett's eyes darted from one small figure to another, and a cold realization settled in his stomach. Every child he saw, a girl walking with a spine twisted sideways, boys dragging themselves across the floor, another with fused, paddle-like hands, bore the visible stamp of a developmental catastrophe. The whispers hadn't been exaggerations. They were understatements. In that moment, Dr. Samuel Garrett's simple investigative visit ended, and an obsession began. For the next 3 hours, with the parents' quiet permission, Dr. Garrett moved through the cabin in a state of controlled professional shock. His notebook, usually filled with straightforward diagnoses, became a ledger of the unbelievable. Each child presented not a single anomaly, but a cascade of them. He examined skeletal malformations that his training declared incompatible with life, saw signs of organ displacement he'd only encountered in the most obscure European texts. Yet, here they were, living, breathing. The children spoke to each other, performed small chores with grim determination, their eyes alert and aware within bodies that had betrayed them utterly. This was the most chilling part, the disconnect between the profound physical ruin and the vibrant trapped consciousness within. They weren't inert specimens, they were individuals, a fact that made the clinical observations feel suddenly invasive. The parents, Sarah and Benjamin, were cooperative, but carried a heavy air of resignation. They answered his questions softly, their manner suggesting they had long ago surrendered to a fate they didn't understand. They were accustomed to being spectacles, to the silence their family invoked. As Garrett packed his instruments, the weight of the unscientific hung in the air. Then, as dusk bled into the hollow, Sarah posed the question that would chase Garrett back down the mountain and haunt his sleep for years to come. She looked up at him, not with anger, but with a weary, desperate need for an answer medicine couldn't give. "Could you tell us," she asked, "why God has cursed us so?" Garrett was a man of science, of reason, but in the face of such concentrated generational suffering, all his knowledge offered no solace, no explanation. He had no answer for her. The ride back was a blur, the twilight world now feeling sinister. The medical curiosity that had driven him up the mountain was now eclipsed by a deeper, more unsettling turmoil. He had witnessed genetic misfortune before, a hereditary condition passed down a family line. But this was different. This wasn't a single trait manifesting. This was a total systemic collapse of normal development, repeated with horrific variation across every offspring. It was as if the very blueprint of human form had been scrambled anew for each child. The rule of heredity, as he understood it, suggested some should have escaped unscathed. Here, the rule was catastrophe. The exception did not exist. Returning to his office, Garrett didn't just file a report. He became possessed. The images of those children, their twisted spines, their intelligent eyes, wouldn't leave him. This was more than a local tragedy. It felt like a key to a dark chamber of human biology that had never been unlocked. He needed to understand not just what had happened to these children, but how such a union had ever come to be. Who were Sarah and Benjamin, really? What paths of abandonment and loneliness had converged to create this perfect storm of genetic disaster? His journey to the cabin was over, but a new, more complex investigation into the past was just beginning. He had to trace their stories backward to find the origins of the catastrophe. To understand the sheer scale of the genetic tragedy unfolding in that cabin, we need to look closer, not as distant historians, but through Dr. Garrett's horrified, meticulous eyes. He began with the parents, the two poles of this biological storm. Sarah Caldwell, née Pennington, stood at just 3 feet 11 inches. Her primordial dwarfism wasn't just a matter of small size. It was a condition where her body had proportionally arrested in a childlike state, yet aged normally. Every measurement confirmed it, but more than her stature, it was her quiet, steely competence that struck Garrett. In a body the world saw as a limitation, she operated as the fierce logistical commander of a household in constant crisis. Then there was Benjamin. Confined to his reinforced chair, he was a monument to a different kind of biological rebellion. Weighing approximately 530 pounds by the time of the later examinations, his condition pointed clearly to a profound pituitary dysfunction, a gland in the brain gone rogue, flooding his system with growth signals he couldn't shut off. His hands were grotesquely enlarged, his features coarsened, his breath a constant struggle against the mass pressing on his lungs. Yet within this imprisoned body was a gentle, keen mind. Garrett noted he was well-spoken, curious, and clearly the emotional anchor for the entire family. Here was the first cruel paradox. Two individuals of immense inner strength, shackled by bodies that made them outcasts. But the true, heart-shattering focus was the children. Garrett, and later the team from Johns Hopkins, would create a clinical catalog that reads like a manual of everything that can go wrong in human development. The eldest girl, around 14, navigated the cabin with a severe scoliosis that twisted her torso nearly perpendicular, every step a painful negotiation with gravity. The twins, David and Daniel, had matching cranial malformations, oversized, misshapen skulls with eyes set too wide, their cognitive development lagging behind their years. One boy had talipes equinovarus, club feet so severe the soles faced each other, making walking impossible. Another child's fingers were completely fused into paddle-like appendages, and the anomalies grew more complex, more internal. One child was found to have situs inversus, a mirror image reversal of organ placement, the heart on the right, the liver on the left. Another had vertebrae so malformed her neck couldn't support her head without aid. There were cleft palates, so severe feeding was a dangerous ordeal, limbs that terminated prematurely, and cases of syndactyly, where fingers and toes were webbed together. This wasn't a family with a single hereditary flaw. This was a grim demonstration of multiple catastrophic genetic errors expressing themselves in a dizzying array of forms, as if nature were conducting a brutal experiment in variation within a single suffering family. Yet, within this catalog of suffering, the most haunting observations weren't about the deformities themselves, but about the life that persisted in spite of them. The doctors noted that the children's minds, in many cases, were tragically disconnected from their physical realities. The boy with reversed organs sang with a clear, strong voice. The girl with fused fingers had taught herself to grip charcoal and created surprisingly detailed sketches on scraps of paper. They quarreled, played quiet games, and showed distinct personalities. The eldest daughter's weary authority, a younger son's mischievous grin. This made the clinical examination feel profoundly unethical, even to the men conducting it. They were measuring and photographing living children who asked with painful clarity, "Can you make us better?" The answer was a silent, shameful no. The family's daily existence was a masterpiece of improvised, grueling logistics. Sarah had developed a precise schedule, a rhythm of care that accounted for who needed to be fed in what position, who needed help moving, and who could manage a small task. Benjamin, from his stationary post, acted as the household's nerve center, holding an infant, listening to a child sound out letters, offering a calm word. The older children, those who could manage limited mobility, became caregivers for the younger ones. It was an ecosystem of mutual dependency, forged not from choice, but from sheer necessity for survival. They had created a world within their walls because the world outside had utterly rejected them, and that rejection was absolute. Neighbors who had initially offered hesitant help had long since withdrawn, fearing a curse. Children from other families were forbidden to approach. A single attempt to attend church ended with a discreet request from the preacher not to return. The local store refused them credit. They depended on the reluctant charity of Benjamin's distant cousins and whatever meager food they could grow or raise themselves. The isolation was a physical and social quarantine, compounding every practical difficulty with a heavy blanket of loneliness. They weren't just fighting their bodies, they were fighting the world's perception of them as monstrous. This was the crushing reality Dr. Garrett and the others walked into, a family unit demonstrating breathtaking human resilience in the face of unimaginable biological misfortune. The doctors held the notebooks, the calipers, the cameras. They possessed the authority of science. But in that dark cabin, Sarah and Benjamin held a different kind of authority, the knowledge of how to keep 10 fragile lives alive for one more day, with no hope of a cure, only the certainty of continued struggle. Science had come to study a phenomenon, but it was utterly unprepared to address the profound human tragedy it represented. The question hanging in the air was no longer just, what caused this, but now that we see it, what do we do? To understand how such a genetic convergence was even possible, we have to rewind the clock and follow the separate, lonely paths that led Sarah Pennington and Benjamin Caldwell to each other. Their story begins not with a curse, but with 2 ordinary families shattered by medical mysteries they couldn't comprehend. Sarah was born in Cincinnati in 1871. By age 3, doctors at the Children's Hospital had a diagnosis for her unchanging miniature stature, primordial dwarfism. In an era that had no framework for such rarity, she became a living exhibit. Her childhood file paints a picture of relentless, dehumanizing measurement, a curiosity for the medical world, but a source of crushing shame and stigma for her family. Unable to withstand the staring and whispers, Sarah's family made an unthinkable decision. When she turned 15, they effectively abandoned her, leaving her in the care of a religious charity in Louisville, Kentucky. This institution was a bleak repository for those society deemed unmarriageable or incapable of self-support. Imagine that moment, a teenage girl, already trapped in a child's body, now stripped of her last connection to family, deposited in a place that signified her life was essentially over. Her future narrowed to the walls of a charity home, but within those same walls, another soul was weathering a different kind of storm. Benjamin Caldwell's early life, on a farm in Breathitt County, Kentucky, was unremarkable until he hit puberty. Then, something in his body's command center, his pituitary gland, went catastrophically wildly wrong. His mother's diary, later discovered, recorded the transformation with mounting horror. He was consumed by an insatiable hunger, his weight doubling and then doubling again. By 16, he was 300 pounds. By 20, over 400. A doctor in Lexington diagnosed a pituitary dysfunction, a label that offered no cure, only a name for the relentless expansion that was breaking down his body and his family's resources. Benjamin's father faced a brutal economic calculus. His son now consumed food meant for 6 people and could no longer perform farm labor. The heartbreaking decision was made. In 1888, Benjamin, too, was taken to the same Louisville charity home. Picture the scene. A young man of immense size, in constant physical discomfort, dumped in an institution because his own family could no longer cope. He was a giant in a cage of despair. These were the raw materials of the tragedy. 2 people cast aside by a world that had no place for them, their bodies deemed failures, their futures written off. Their meeting wasn't destiny. It was the collision of 2 abandoned souls in the only place left for them. Within the grim institutional walls, something unexpected happened. Sarah saw past Benjamin's staggering size, past the labored breathing in the chair that confined him, to the gentle, intelligent man trapped inside. And Benjamin, for the first time in years, encountered someone who didn't look at him with fear, pity, or revulsion. In each other they found a refuge from the world's rejection. For the charity administrators, their union was likely a convenient solution, a way to reduce two burdens to one. In 1889, Sarah Pennington and Benjamin Caldwell were married. It was less a romantic ceremony and more a transaction of survival, sanctioned by relief. With little more than donated supplies and a desperate hope for peace, the newlyweds left Louisville. They sought the most remote shelter possible, a place where society's judging eyes couldn't find them. They ended up in a hollow in Harlan County, where Benjamin's distant cousins, perhaps out of a reluctant sense of obligation, allowed them to build a crude cabin on unused land. Here, in isolation, they built a fragile version of a normal life. They were finally free from stares and whispers. But they were also free from any medical guidance, any genetic counseling, any warning of what might come next. What were they thinking when Sarah became pregnant, that first time in the spring of 1890? Was it hope, a desire for the family they'd both been denied, or simply the natural human impulse to create something of their own in a world that had offered them so little? They had no frame of reference. The medical science of 1897, as Dr. Garrett discovered, offered no precedent, no warning label for such a union. Gregor Mendel's groundbreaking work on genetic inheritance was gathering dust in European libraries, completely unknown to American doctors. Sarah and Benjamin were stepping into a biological darkness, completely unaware of the storm of recessive genetic traits they each carried, a storm that would express itself with catastrophic creativity in their children. And so the stage was set. Two people carrying profound and separate genetic burdens found solace in each other and retreated from the world. In their search for simple human connection and a family of their own, they unknowingly set in motion one of the most tragic natural experiments in medical history. They weren't reckless or ignorant in the way we might judge today. They were profoundly alone, operating in an informational void. Their first pregnancy wasn't just the beginning of a family, it was the first draw in a genetic lottery with the worst possible odds. The isolation that protected them from scorn would also imprison them with the consequences. While doctors would later arrive with notebooks and theories, the first and most consistent witness to the unfolding tragedy was a local woman named Martha Combs, the community midwife. Her detailed log book, preserved by the Harlan County Historical Society, provides a raw, real-time account of the family's descent. It's a document that begins with professional duty, evolves into dread, and ultimately fractures under the weight of what she was helping to bring into the world. Her first entry, for the birth of James in January 1891, notes Sarah's difficult 36-hour labor due to her tiny pelvis. When the boy emerged, Martha's experienced hands immediately felt the problem. Severe bilateral club feet, the bones twisted at unnatural angles. She noted the condition and her private doubt that he would ever walk normally. Yet she also recorded Sarah's tears of relief. He was alive. Survival was blessing enough, but the pattern was established with terrifying speed. Barely 6 months later, Sarah was pregnant again. Martha voiced her concerns, but Sarah dismissed them. The second child, a girl born in May 1892, arrived with the same clubbed feet and something new, a pronounced curvature of the spine that would grow into a hump. The log entries begin to change. The clinical details remain, but a note of foreboding seeps in. Word was spreading through the isolated mountain communities. The initial neighborly kindness shown to the odd couple began to curdle into suspicion and fear. The births were no longer private family events, they were becoming local omens. The turning point came with the twins in March 1893. Both boys were born with severe cranial malformations, misshapen skulls, prominent bulging foreheads. Martha's writing grows colder, more detached, as if she's building an emotional barricade against what she's seeing. She records the whispers turning to open judgment. One woman told her directly that God was punishing an unnatural union, that such people should never have married. The twins, David and Daniel, survived, but their developmental delays were obvious. Martha's log now documents not just the physical facts of birth, but the expanding social catastrophe. Each new child compounded the family's isolation, transforming them from objects of pity into pariahs. By the fourth pregnancy, Martha was terrified. She urged Sarah to stop, gently explaining that each birth seemed to bring worse afflictions. Sarah refused to even discuss it. Whether from religious faith, denial, or a stubborn determination to claim some normalcy, she carried the child to term. The girl born in November 1894 had hands that shocked even the seasoned midwife, fingers completely fused into solid, paddle-like appendages. Martha's entry is a masterpiece of understated horror. After this birth, the last of the neighboring families stopped visiting entirely. Parents forbade their children from going near the Caldwell property. The family was now in absolute quarantine, with Martha as their sole, conflicted link to the outside world. Martha Combs continued her grim duty, driven by a mix of professional obligation, a flicker of compassion, and what she herself called a grim fascination. Her notes from this period reveal a woman at war with herself. She felt complicit, an enabler in an ongoing tragedy. Yet she also knew that without her skill, both mother and infants would likely die in the remote cabin. What was the greater moral wrong, to assist or to abandon them? She was trapped. Her log becomes the record of a horrifying scientific pattern observed by someone with no science to explain it. By 1895, she writes with chilling clarity. Everyone involved understood. Each pregnancy produced severe abnormalities. Each birth deepened the isolation. Each new life was both a salvation and a sentence. The entries grow sparse, almost cryptic, as the emotional toll mounts. After the birth of the sixth child in 1896, a boy with one arm ending at the elbow and a leg twisted backward, Martha wrote a line that echoes with poetic despair. They sought healing from what poisons the earth itself, and the earth answered. This references a desperate, misguided turn the parents had taken. Crushed by hopelessness, they had listened to a mountain recluse who sold them a tonic of crushed lead filings and foxglove leaves, promising to thin the heavy blood and make their next child whole. It was a poison that likely caused even more damage. Martha's brief note captures the entire tragedy, their search for any answer, and how that very search led them deeper into ruin. The burden of silent witness finally broke her. 3 weeks after Dr. Garrett's initial visit in March 1897, it was Martha's letter that transformed his curiosity into obsession. She could no longer carry the knowledge alone. Her correspondence revealed the stunning truth. Garrett had seen only part of the family. There weren't 4 or 6 children. There were 8, with more births occurring unbeknownst to him between 1895 and 1896. The midwife, the keeper of the family's most intimate moments, had finally cried out for someone, anyone, in the medical establishment to see what she saw and perhaps to explain it. Martha's logbook is more than a medical record. It is the human heartbeat of this story, chronicling the moment-by-moment reality that the later doctors would only analyze from a distance. It shows us the point where compassion frays into helplessness, where duty twists into guilt. She was the first to document the genetic catastrophe not as a theory, but as a relentless, lived experience. Her final wrenching entry in July 1898 lays her soul bare. I have delivered monsters into this world for 7 years and can no longer pretend I am helping anyone. Each birth adds to suffering that never ends. With that, the midwife's direct testimony closes, leaving the family in the hands of science, a science that was about to descend upon them with its own set of complications and moral failures. Armed with Martha's shocking letter and his own detailed notes, Dr. Samuel Garrett faced a wall of genteel disbelief. He sent his meticulous report to the pinnacle of American medical authority. Dr. William Osler at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Charles Davenport at Harvard, and Dr. Horatio Wood in Philadelphia. These were men who shaped the future of medicine from polished city offices. Their responses, when they arrived months later, were a master class in academic dismissal. Osler was politely skeptical, suggesting Garrett had exaggerated or been deceived about the parents' relation. Davenport's reply carried a condescending edge, implying a country doctor lacked the training to diagnose such complexities. Only Wood showed interest, but it was a dark curiosity. He fixated on the idea the parents must be secretly closely related, that consanguinity was the only logical explanation for such ruin. The rejection stung, but it also steeled Garrett's resolve. He wasn't just being ignored. The very reality he had witnessed was being politely erased from consideration. He fired back letters with additional documentation, crude photographs, copies of Martha's birth records, detailed charts. He adamantly defended his findings, emphasizing the parents' separate origins and distinct conditions. He was no longer just a physician reporting a case. He was an advocate for a truth too inconvenient for the establishment to accept. His frustration reached its peak with a cold realization: academic medicine would never believe him without seeing it for themselves. He needed to bring a witness with unimpeachable credibility to the hollow. So Garrett changed tactics. In December 1896, he wrote directly to a younger rising star known for challenging orthodoxy, Dr. Llewellyn Barker, also at Johns Hopkins. This letter wasn't a dry submission. It was a provocation. Garrett acknowledged how impossible the case sounded, admitted it dismantled everything he'd learned, and then issued a direct challenge. "Come see for yourself," he wrote, "or forever wonder if you dismiss the most important hereditary case study of the century." It was a gamble. He was essentially daring a renowned institution to look upon what the world had discarded. 3 months later, the gamble paid off. A telegram arrived. Barker was coming to Kentucky, and he was bringing a team, a geneticist, Dr. Harold Fenton, and a medical photographer with state-of-the-art equipment. In Barker's private correspondence, he revealed he expected to debunk what he called another example of rural medical hysteria. He was traveling to the mountains not as a pilgrim to a medical mystery, but as an inquisitor, ready to expose a hoax or a country doctor's overactive imagination. He was prepared for a professional triumph of skepticism. He was utterly unprepared for what awaited him in the Caldwell cabin. Dr. Barker and his team arrived in Harlan County on April 23, 1897, after a 5-day journey from Baltimore that felt like traveling back in time. Their sophisticated equipment and academic airs were profoundly out of place in the rugged landscape. Barker's first examination of the parents shattered his expectations within minutes. His clinical notes, usually so detached, betray his shock. He confirmed Sarah's primordial dwarfism with precise measurement. He observed Benjamin's pituitary dysfunction in the coarse features, the enormous hands, the monumental struggle for breath. Garrett's descriptions, he was forced to admit, were not exaggerations. If anything, they were understated. The reality in the dim cabin was more visceral, more present than any report could convey. Then Barker turned his systematic gaze to the children. Working from oldest to youngest, he and Fenton began a methodical, invasive cataloging. The photographer's flash illuminated the cramped space, capturing unprecedented images of hereditary catastrophe. They measured skulls, tested reflexes, and used the crude diagnostic tools of 1897 to guess at internal chaos. Fenton took exhaustive family histories, digging for any missed connection, any hint of shared blood that could explain this through simple consanguinity. For 3 days, the remote cabin became an impromptu and heartbreaking laboratory, the children its unwilling subjects. What emerged from this intensive study defied the era's simple genetic theories. The parents shared no common ancestry traceable through 4 generations. Their conditions, Sarah's dwarfism, Benjamin's pituitary disorder, were separate in origin and mechanism. Yet their children displayed a bewildering array of malformations that suggested something far more complex than the inheritance of a single dominant trait. Staring at this data, Barker formulated a hypothesis. He proposed, in notes shared with Fenton, that each parent carried multiple recessive genetic factors, hidden errors, beyond their obvious conditions. When combined, these hidden factors expressed themselves in catastrophic, unpredictable ways. It was a stroke of intuitive genius, remarkably close to the principles of Mendelian genetics, though Barker was likely unaware of Mendel's still obscure work. He was essentially rediscovering a fundamental law of heredity through the lens of its most devastating possible outcome. The scientific triumph, however, was immediately poisoned by ethical horror. Barker's correspondence reveals his mounting conflict. Here was a natural experiment of priceless scientific value, a family that offered a brutal clarity on human inheritance. But they were not specimens. They were suffering people who had asked for help and received only measurement. The team's mission had shifted from debunking a myth to documenting a tragedy, and they now had to decide what, if anything, to do with that knowledge. The scientific revelation within the cabin was as dark as it was illuminating. Barker and Fenton began to see patterns in the chaos. The skeletal malformations, while varying in severity, suggested a shared underlying genetic defect expressing itself differently in each child. Organ displacement appeared in multiple siblings, always involving the same systems, but in unique configurations. Most troubling was the cognitive assessment. Some children, like the eldest James, demonstrated sharp, normal intelligence despite their ruined bodies. Others, like one of the twins, showed profound developmental delays, hinting at invisible brain malformations. This wasn't random damage, it was a systematic, if horrifically diverse, expression of flawed genetic instructions. The data was undeniable, but its human cost was unbearable. Before leaving Kentucky, Barker sat with Benjamin and Sarah to explain, as gently as a scientist could, what he believed was happening. He told them their children's conditions stemmed from an unfortunate combination of hidden factors they both carried. Each pregnancy, he said, was a genetic lottery with impossibly bad odds. Benjamin, clutching at a final shred of hope, asked the question that had anchored his guilt for years. Was there any chance a future child could be born healthy? Barker's answer, documented in his notes, was devastatingly honest. Based on the pattern across 9 births, the statistical probability approached 0. Every child would almost certainly suffer. Sarah's response was silence. No tears, no protest. She simply nodded, as if Barker had finally confirmed a terrible secret she had always known in her heart, but had refused to voice. That silent acceptance was perhaps the most heartbreaking moment of all. The knowledge had been delivered, but it brought no power, no solution, only the final extinguishing of hope. 3 months later, the cruel, inevitable punchline. Sarah discovered she was pregnant with her 10th child. The science had explained the tragedy, but it had done nothing to prevent it. The biological drive, or perhaps the sheer lack of means or knowledge to prevent conception, rolled onward. Back at Johns Hopkins, Barker's report ignited not just scientific interest, but a fierce ethical debate within his own team. Harold Fenton argued that preventing future births was a moral imperative, a duty to stop the creation of more suffering. The team's photographer, a religious man, insisted such decisions belonged only to God. Barker found himself trapped between two poles, the scientific fascination with a unique living case study and the human compassion that recoiled at the thought of another child born only to endure pain for the sake of data. The Caldwell family was no longer just a family. In the eyes of medicine, they had become a profound and painful dilemma. The 10th child, born in February 1898, seemed to defy the very logic of biology. Martha's records describe an infant who failed to breathe for 12 agonizing minutes. When she finally did, it was shallow, irregular. She had a cleft palate extending into her nasal cavity, but the external horror was nothing compared to the internal. Her chest wall had developed incompletely, leaving portions of her lungs partially exposed beneath a thin, translucent layer of skin. Garrett, present at the birth, immediately sent for Barker. This wasn't just another malformation, it was a new threshold of impossibility. Exposed lung tissue should have meant immediate fatal infection. Yet the child clung to life, wheezing and struggling, a biological paradox that left the doctors in awe and horror. Barker returned with a pulmonary specialist. Their examination confirmed the infant's survival was medically inexplicable. His photographs from this visit show a being that seems barely held together by the thinnest threads of biological function. Here was the ultimate grim validation of Barker's theory. The genetic combinations were not just producing deformities, but were scrambling the fundamental architectural plans of human development in ways that pushed the very boundaries of viability. Each child was a unique experiment in survival against impossible odds. Science could only stand and document. It could not intervene, could not heal. The relentless cycle continued. Sarah was pregnant again before the 10th child was 6 months old. Martha's journal entry from July 1898 captures a spirit broken by years of complicity. I have delivered monsters into this world for 7 years and can no longer pretend I am helping anyone. The 11th pregnancy brought twins in January 1899, born premature. Their conditions overlapped in a perfect storm of catastrophe. Spina bifida, with exposed spinal cords, malformed hearts, soft unfused skulls, and digestive systems that weren't fully connected. They were, in Barker's later post-mortem words, as if the genetic instructions for human development had been scrambled beyond recognition. The first twin died in 18 hours, the second in 4 days. They were the first deaths in the family. For Sarah and Benjamin, these were their sons to be buried on the property, marked with wooden crosses Benjamin carved himself. No preacher would come. They buried them alone. For Barker, receiving the telegram, it was crucial data. For Garrett, it was a moment of agonized hope. Surely this loss would finally end the pregnancies. But 3 months later, Sarah was pregnant for the 12th and final time. Barker's response, in correspondence, was coldly scientific. One more pregnancy would complete the statistical sample. In that stark contrast lies the entire moral chasm of the story, a family living a tragedy, and the science that could only see it as a completed set of data points. While doctors debated statistics and recessive genes in distant cities, Sarah and Benjamin were living the daily, grinding reality of the curse. By the winter of 1895, after the birth of their 5th severely deformed child, a desperate primal hope broke through their resignation. They turned away from the science that had no answers and toward the oldest comfort of the mountains, folk remedy. Their guide was a recluse named Elias Burke, a man who claimed knowledge of old mountain cures passed down from his grandfather, a man who supposedly fixed children born wrong. Burke offered a diagnosis that made a desperate kind of sense to people who felt poisoned by their own blood. He told them their affliction wasn't genetic, but a blockage of vitality, a humoral imbalance. The solution was a tonic, a brutal concoction meant to thin the heavy blood and cleanse the system, making the next child whole. He sold Benjamin a bottle of murky liquid, crushed lead filings, foxglove leaves, and raw alcohol. In our terms, he sold them a slow-acting poison and a powerful cardiac toxin, but in their terms, he sold them hope. Benjamin, too trusting and shattered by helplessness, took the tonic daily. Sarah, hesitant but driven by a wife's solidarity and the sworn testimony of Elias's wife that it had cured barrenness, took her own dose mixed with molasses. The medicine burned their throats and caused violent sickness, but they interpreted the suffering as a necessary purification, a fiery trial on the path to healing. They were performing an ancient ritual of desperation, accepting present pain to ward off future catastrophe. In their isolated hollow, this toxic brew became a sacred elixir. When the sixth child was born the following spring, his deformities were among the worst Martha had yet witnessed. One arm ending at the elbow, a leg twisted backward at the knee. Her journal entry that night is a brief haunting poem of despair. They sought healing from what poisons the earth itself, and the earth answered. The tonic had done nothing but likely introduce additional teratogenic agents into Sarah's ravaged body. It was a second superimposed tragedy, not born of malice but of a naive, devastating hope. Two outcasts, abandoned by medicine and society, had reached for a lifeline and grasped a snake. Dr. Garrett later discovered the remnants of that terrible bottle in the Caldwell cabin. The label read, B. & Sons Pharmacological Remedies, Lexington. Its ingredients, lead acetate and foxglove extract, would be unequivocally outlawed as poisons within a few years. Modern analysis confirms both are potent teratogens, substances that can cause catastrophic congenital malformations in a developing fetus. The cruel irony is absolute. In their quest to cleanse the bad blood they believed caused their children suffering, Sarah and Benjamin had likely been poisoning the very source of life, potentially exacerbating the genetic disaster with environmental trauma. This episode strips the story down to its raw human core. It wasn't about ignorance in the face of known science. For the Caldwells, established science had arrived, taken notes, and left them with a devastating probability, zero chance of a healthy child. What were they supposed to do with that? The tonic represented an alternative system of knowledge, one that offered agency, however false. It allowed them to do something, to fight back, rather than just passively accept a genetic death sentence pronounced by men who then rode away. Their choice highlights the utter void of support they lived in. The failed tonic did more than just poison a pregnancy. It poisoned their last reservoir of hope. After this, a grim finality seemed to settle over the household. The later pregnancies, from the 10th child with exposed lungs to the doomed twins, felt like a fateful march to a predetermined end. They had tried isolation, they had tried science, they had tried folk magic. Every door had closed. All that remained was the biological momentum of conception and the formidable silent endurance of Sarah, whose body became the repeated battleground for a war it could not win. This chapter of the story forces us to ask, what is the moral responsibility of knowledge? The doctors knew the cause, or thought they did. They knew the outcome was virtually certain. Yet, in the ethical framework of the 1890s, and lacking any practical means or social authority to intervene, they left the family with that knowledge and nothing else. In that vacuum, the tonics and the superstitions rushed in. The Caldwells' tragedy wasn't just written in their genes, it was compounded by the stark divide between the emerging science of why things happen and the complete absence of a medicine for what to do about it. When Dr. Barker's comprehensive report finally reached the Journal of Heredity in March 1900, accompanied by stark photographs and detailed genealogical charts, it didn't just enter a medical discussion, it ignited a firestorm. The initial publication in July sparked outrage from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Edmund Sterling, a prominent Boston physician, published a scathing rebuke. He argued that such detailed documentation of human deformity served no legitimate scientific purpose, that it degraded both the medical profession and the unfortunate subjects. He raised a pointed, modern-sounding ethical question. Had this impoverished, isolated family truly given informed consent, or was their cooperation merely the reflex of those who had never been allowed to say no? Barker defended his work fiercely in subsequent issues. He insisted that understanding hereditary mechanisms required the unflinching study of extreme cases. To look away, he argued, was to surrender to superstition. The Caldwell family represented a natural experiment that might never recur. Refusing to document it would be a betrayal of scientific duty. But in making this argument, he had unwittingly tossed a lit match into the dry tinder of a growing national movement: eugenics. Almost immediately, his careful, tragic case study was weaponized. Dr. Albert H., a vocal eugenics advocate, seized on Barker's findings. In the American Journal of Public Health in October 1900, he used the Caldwell children as his central, shocking evidence. He argued the case proved the state had a responsibility, a moral duty to prevent such genetic unfitness. He proposed legislation requiring the sterilization of individuals with severe hereditary conditions, citing Sarah and Benjamin explicitly as people who should never have been allowed to marry or reproduce. The family's private tragedy was now a public exhibit in a campaign for social control. Barker was horrified. His private correspondence shows a man wrestling with the monstrous, unintended consequences of his work. He had sought to advance knowledge, not provide a textbook example for forced sterilization. But once published, the data took on a life of its own. The eugenics faction across America began citing the Kentucky family as justification for increasingly extreme policies. The very documentation meant to inspire awe at the complexity of heredity was being used to justify its brutal, simplistic management. The Caldwells had become pawns in an ideological war they could not possibly understand. The controversy reached its ugly public peak in April 1901, when a Philadelphia newspaper obtained and published photographs from the case file without permission. These images, meant for sterile medical education, were splashed across the page alongside sensationalized text describing genetic horrors and a cursed bloodline. Public reaction was swift and cruel. Letters to the editor debated whether such families should be isolated or institutionalized for the public good. The Caldwells were no longer a medical case study or a eugenicist's example. In the public imagination, they had become monsters, a sideshow curiosity. This exposure shattered any remaining peace for the family. Dr. Garrett, watching from Kentucky, found himself caught in a trap of his own making. He had contacted academic medicine, hoping to find help or answers for the family. Instead, he had magnified their suffering 1,000-fold, exposing them to a level of scrutiny and judgment far worse than the local shunning they had endured. His later correspondence shows frantic attempts to shield them, denying requests from medical students wanting educational visits, turning away traveling show promoters who offered money to exhibit them. Sarah and Benjamin, with quiet dignity, refused all such offers even as they desperately needed the funds. The medical debate, meanwhile, raged in journals through 1902 with no resolution. One side saw the case as a cornerstone for essential hereditary research. The other saw it as the ultimate example of unethical exploitation, where subjects gained no benefit and could not give meaningful consent. Lost in this academic and public warfare were the actual human beings. 10 children were growing older, their conditions not improving, their needs not lessening. Sarah and Benjamin were aging under an impossible burden, their family now a symbol in a hateful debate they barely comprehended. The chapter closes on the most damning unanswered question of all. Now that medicine had so thoroughly documented their existence, measured their bones, photographed their bodies, charted their lineage. What was its responsibility to actually help them? The answer, in the early 1900s, was a resounding silence. Science had taken everything it needed from the Caldwell family. It had given them nothing in return but notoriety and grief. Their value as data points had been exhausted. Their value as people had been utterly forgotten. Amidst the noise of scandal and scientific debate, a quiet human counter-narrative was being written. In 1900, a young teacher named Grace Holloway arrived in Harlan County from Lexington. Learning of the isolated family, she insisted that the children capable of learning deserved an education. Her diary, later donated to the Kentucky Historical Society, provides the most intimate, heartbreaking, and hopeful portrait we have of the Caldwells beyond their pathologies. Her first visit in September 1900 revealed not a house of horrors, but a household of breathtaking, improvised order. Grace described a world of carefully orchestrated routines. The eldest daughter, despite her severely twisted spine, managed the younger children with a competent, weary authority. James, the firstborn with clubbed feet, had taught himself to walk with crude crutches and helped his immobile father. Grace identified 3 children with the clear mental capacity for learning: James, one of the younger girls, and, surprisingly, one of the twins with the misshapen skull, whose cognitive development had proceeded normally. She began visiting twice a week, bringing primers. Her entries glow with a subdued wonder. The children were hungry for knowledge, eager to prove they had minds worth nurturing, despite bodies the world saw as monstrous. Through Grace's eyes, we see the family's internal dynamics. Sarah, aged far beyond her years, was the logistical genius of survival. She had devised specific feeding strategies for cleft palates, positions to ease breathing, a meticulous schedule of care. Benjamin, from his anchored chair, was the emotional and intellectual heart. He had taught himself extensively from borrowed books and led his children in discussions of history, math, and morality. Grace recorded conversations where his clarity of thought rivaled that of her college professors. His physical imprisonment had forged a formidable intellect. The diary reveals profound, ordinary humanity shining through the extraordinary suffering. The girl with fused fingers taught herself to draw, gripping charcoal between her paddle-like hands. The boy with situs inversus, his organs reversed, sang constantly with a clear, strong voice. They squabbled, they joked, they had favorite things. Grace never succumbs to sentimentality. She also records the seizures, the terrifying infections, the sheer exhaustion on Sarah's face. But she bears witness to the truth the medical reports ignored. These were not just a collection of symptoms. They were a family. They loved, they learned, and they persevered. Grace's presence began to soften ever so slightly the wall of isolation around the family. Perhaps shamed by the academic attention or simply worn down by years of a neighbor's obvious need, Benjamin's cousins convinced a few local families to contribute supplies. A carpenter built specialized furniture, including a supported chair for the child who could not hold up her own head. These were small mercies, but they were tangible, cracks in the fortress of rejection the Caldwells had lived within for a decade. The community's conscience, it seemed, could be pricked not by pity for deformity, but by respect for a teacher's mission and the visible evidence of the children's eager minds. The most piercing moment in the diary comes in December 1900. James, now 12 and perceptive beyond his years, asked Grace a question that stopped her cold. "Why do doctors keep coming to stare at us but never make us better?" She had no good answer. The boy then offered his own heartbreaking analysis. "I expect we're valuable to science. I just wonder if science values us as people." In that simple statement, James articulated the entire ethical failure at the core of his family's experience. They understood their role as specimens. They just wished, desperately, to also be seen as patients, or better yet, just as people. By 1901, 5 of the Caldwell children were attending Grace's informal lessons regularly. 2 learned to read at grade level. 1 showed a remarkable aptitude for arithmetic. These achievements, the triumph of mind over catastrophic biology, would never appear in the Journal of Heredity. They held no value for the eugenicists, but Grace's diary preserves them. They are a testament to resilience, to the unquenchable human drive to learn and connect, even in the most hostile of physical circumstances. The children were claiming for themselves an identity beyond their diagnosis. Grace Holloway's diary closes a vital loop in this story. For years, the narrative had been defined by what was taken from the Caldwells, their health, their privacy, their dignity. Grace's work represented the only thing ever genuinely given, a recognition of their intellectual humanity and the gift of knowledge. It was a fleeting kindness in a life of relentless hardship, but it proved that within the devastating genetic legacy, there existed minds worth teaching, spirits worth acknowledging, and a family worth seeing in full, not as a catalog of errors, but as a community of survivors. The relentless progression of time, which had brought so much scrutiny, now began to erase the Caldwell family from the world. The first to go was Benjamin. In November 1905, his heart, strained for decades to pump blood through his immense body, simply stopped. His death was more than a loss. It was a structural collapse. He had been the family's emotional bedrock and its only source of male guidance. His gentle voice reading lessons, his steadying presence, gone. Sarah, now 44, and physically shattered by 12 pregnancies, was left alone as the sole caretaker for 8 surviving children with profound needs. The Harlan County Poor Commission offered what they saw as the only solution: remove the children to a state institution. Sarah's response was the same fierce refusal she had given years before. She would not send her children away to die among strangers. Dr. Garrett's involvement effectively ended in 1906. His final visit found Sarah maintaining the impossible routines through sheer, brittle will. Yet even in this twilight, his notes capture flickers of that enduring spirit. A boy teaching himself to play a harmonica despite webbed fingers. Another child reciting Bible passages Benjamin had taught them. Then the paper trail goes cold. The official record simply stops. The 1910 U.S. Census lists Sarah Caldwell, living alone in Harlan County. No children are mentioned beside her name. No death certificates for the 8 remaining children appear in the county archives. The most likely silent conclusion is that they died, one by one, over those 5 years, and were buried on the property beside their 2 infant brothers, in graves marked by wooden crosses that the weather would soon erase. Sarah herself was found in her cabin in July 1913 by Benjamin's cousins, several days after she had died. She was 42 years old. Her death certificate lists the cause vaguely as general debility, a body and spirit utterly worn out. The county buried her beside Benjamin and their children. No service was held. The medical papers that had once caused such an uproar gathered dust in academic archives. The case that had ignited fierce ethical debates and fueled a movement faded into total obscurity, remembered only by the few who had witnessed it firsthand. The hollow reclaimed its silence. For decades the story lay dormant. Then, in 1962, a medical historian rummaging in the Louisville Medical Archives rediscovered Dr. Garrett's papers. In the light of modern genetics, the tragedy finally found its full explanation. Retrospective analysis confirmed it was not a curse nor the result of hidden inbreeding, but an astronomically unlikely convergence. 2 individuals, each carrying multiple severe and separate recessive genetic disorders, finding each other and reproducing. The probability was vanishingly small. It was extraordinarily bad genetic fortune, not an inevitable consequence. Science had finally, belatedly, caught up to the truth the family had lived and died for. In 1983, the local historical society placed a simple granite marker at the forgotten burial site in the Kentucky Hollow. No medical terminology is engraved there, no mention of primordial dwarfism or pituitary dysfunction. It bears only names and dates. That stone is a quiet, belated apology from a community that once looked away. It is an acknowledgement that these were people whose lives held inherent value, far beyond their unwitting contribution to science. They were not a case study, they were a family. Today, the documents of the Caldwell family, Garrett's notes, Barker's reports, Martha's log, Grace's diary, are digitized, accessible to researchers worldwide. They continue to contribute to our understanding of genetic inheritance and the long, painful evolution of medical ethics. They serve as a stark historical lesson in the chasm between observation and compassion, between exploiting tragedy and alleviating suffering. Anyone who examines those records now encounters not just data, but the ghostly echoes of real children who smiled through pain, a mother who refused to surrender, and a father who taught them about the world from a chair he could not leave. So, what is the legacy of this family? It's a story that holds a dark mirror to the history of medicine itself. It shows us the moment when science began to see the awesome power of heredity, but had not yet developed a conscience to guide its use. It reminds us that behind every monumental case study, behind every debated datum, there are human beings asking the simplest and most profound question: can you make us better? The Caldwell family's value to science is undeniable, but their greater lesson is for all of us, that the pursuit of knowledge must never outpace our duty to human dignity. This is the story of the family that shocked science. A story not of monsters, but of people. A story not just of genetic catastrophe, but of quiet courage, of love in isolation, and of the enduring, fragile will to live a life, however difficult, on your own terms. If this journey into a forgotten chapter of history has moved you, or made you think differently about the intersection of medicine and humanity, let us know in the comments below. What struck you most about the Caldwell family's story? And as always, if you want to join us for more deep dives into the lost corners of history, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.